Hello everybody, my name is John Wessner. I'm a Civil War reenactor with the 31st Virginia Infantry Company C. I've been a reenactor now for over 20 years. It's a wonderful hobby. I've learned some great things, met some great people through this hobby, and my reason for being here today is so that I can share with you some of the basic information about the arms and equipment of a Civil War infantry soldier. Now, the 31st Virginia Infantry is a Confederate regiment. A regiment was a group of about 1,000 soldiers at full strength, although most regiments didn't stay at full strength for very long due to casualties and due to wounds, as well as desertion. So the 31st Virginia Infantry, actually their story's pretty neat in and of itself, because they were a unit that was raised out of the area that is today known as West Virginia. But at the beginning of the Civil War, there was no West Virginia. There was only Virginia. In fact, Virginia bordered Pennsylvania, because today West Virginia bordered Pennsylvania. During the Civil War, West Virginia decided, the western counties of Virginia decided that they would secede from Virginia, break away from Virginia, and stay loyal to the United States. Virginia joined the Confederate States of America. So the state of Virginia was actually divided, and part of the reason for that vote was a lot of the folks who were loyal to the South or loyal to Virginia had already enlisted and gone off to fight. So when they took the vote, the people that were left weren't the folks that were out doing the fighting. So that was part of the reason that that vote passed, and part of the reason that West Virginia is a state today. So one common question might be, why am I reenacting as a Confederate? I live in Pennsylvania, so I live in a Union state. The Confederate, sometimes people say, oh, they were the bad guys, and some of them were, but not everybody, and that's kind of why I chose this side. First of all, living in Pennsylvania, I'm a teacher, and I like to teach people things maybe they didn't know. So one of the things that I learned pretty early on when I was studying the Civil War is that even though the South was fighting in some ways for slavery, in other ways there were other things going on, and the regular soldiers, the guys that were out doing the fighting, they weren't the slave owners. The slave owners were the really, really rich guys, and they were the ones who were deciding why the government was going to war. And why people would fight in this war. And so they're the ones that kind of decided the war was going to happen. But the regular guy that was out there doing the fighting, marching in the field and carrying his musket, well, those soldiers, they were too poor to own slaves. They were regular guys. They were regular farmers on their homes. And they were fighting in a lot of ways because there was a war. And they were now part of this new country, and their country's at war. So they're going to go fight for their country, just like people today fight to defend America. So the other thing that happened is at the beginning of the war, the United States Army marched through the South, and they came to the southern states. Well, if there's an army coming through my state, coming through my town, and putting my family at risk, I'm certainly going to be fighting or doing my best to keep my family and my neighbors safe. So that's another thing that was going on. So as I started to learn more about the common soldier and why the common soldier fought, I thought that was pretty interesting. I used to think, oh, all the South, they were all about slavery, and that's what they all wanted. And when I learned that it wasn't what everybody wanted, and even for the soldiers, that I think only 10% of them actually owned slaves, I read once. So I thought that was pretty interesting. There was some more individuality, so just as a reenactor, I thought it was kind of neat that I'd get to pick my own uniform or design my own uniform a little bit. The South didn't have a lot of the same factories and manufacturing abilities as the North, so they kind of used what they could get, what they could make from home, or what their families could make from home, so I thought that was all interesting as well. So some of those things I thought were pretty neat, and so I thought that would be fun to teach about. So that's part of why I do this. Other Confederate reenactors have been able to trace their ancestors to soldiers that fought in the South, so they fight to honor them or they reenact to honor them. So lots of different reasons that people might choose to reenact on a different side. I certainly believe that all people are created equal, and I'm certainly glad for the rights that we have in America today. Certainly wouldn't want to see us go back to the time period where some of the things that were allowed in the South were allowed. So I'm glad that we are where we are today, and certainly appreciate that aspect of our life in this time, in modern times. Okay? So like I said, what I want to do today, I don't want to spend a lot of time discussing the causes of the war, some of those things, all the different battles of the war, because there's lots of information out there on that if you're curious and would like to learn more. What I want to talk about today mainly is the regular soldier, a regular common Confederate infantryman, and much of what I talk about today would be the same whether it was a Confederate soldier or a Union soldier. So as we do this, I like to start at the top and work my way down. So we'll start here with my hat. This style of hat is called a forage cap. Okay? Now, if you know the word forage, the vocab term forage means to search for things, especially to search for food. So the reason that this is called a forage cap is because I can flop that down and I have sort of a bucket here. And back behind me here, actually, I have some raspberry bushes here. They're not producing raspberries yet because it's spring, but when raspberries grew on that bush, if I were on the march, if I were marching from place to place and we had time to stop, I could walk over here, I could pick some of those berries, I could put them in my hat and use that and carry that for a little bit perhaps. I could pass it around, share it with my friends, share it with my fellow soldiers. So things like that. That would give me a sort of bucket that I could wear. I could even tuck a little in this extra piece of fabric, keep it on my head, and I could store some for later as well. So that was a handy thing. One of the reasons that I selected this style of hat to wear is because it was very famously worn by a general named Thomas Jackson. He was better known as Stonewall Jackson. But Thomas Jackson was one of the most interesting people that I've ever read about. I've really enjoyed studying his life, learning about him. Really, really neat guy. So part of the reason I chose this style of hat was sort of to honor the style of hat that he wore. It wasn't a very popular type of hat. The Union Army and also the Confederate Army had a similar style of hat without that extra flop of fabric called a kepi. So just kind of a shorter version of that didn't have that extra floppiness. The kepi was worn by the North and the South. In the North, that was basically the hat you were issued by the Army, similar for the South. But what happened in the Confederate Army is a lot of soldiers decided this hat was terrible, and they threw these away, and they kept the hat they had maybe worn all their lives or worn back at home on their farms. So this was known as a slouch hat, okay? And many soldiers preferred this hat. For one thing, it has a much wider brim, and the brim goes the whole way around, whereas the kepi style of hat, and by the way, when you hear the word kepi, kepi is a French word. A lot of the terms that were used in the military in the 1800s came from French because soldiers had studied the work of a French leader named Napoleon. When you listen to the word kepi, you can almost hear the word cap there, so that's where the word cap kind of comes from, is from that French term as well. So this just has a very small brim on the front of the hat, nothing around the back. So if it rains, the rain goes down the back of my neck. If it's real sunny, I get sunburned. So this style of hat would give me shade on the back of my neck on a sunny day. It would give me also protection from the rain, so the rain would go down the brim of the hat and off the back where it's not going to roll right down my shirt. So this style of hat, here's another slouch hat. They called these slouch hats. I can't remember if I said that or not. So just a wide-brimmed felt hat was much more common, much more popular among the soldiers. Okay? Okay, draped around me here, I have a blanket. They called this a blanket roll. And what I could actually do with this, this would be my blanket, but I would also tuck things inside of here as well. So I could roll up extra clothes, extra socks, anything that I might need that was cloth, I could roll inside of this blanket, carry it across my body, and that made an easy way to carry my supplies. These guys in the infantry, they were marching soldiers. Infantry were foot soldiers, so they were walking, sometimes up to 20 to 30 miles a day. Now, for those of you from my area here in central Pennsylvania, I live in Hollidaysburg, so I'd march 20 to 30 miles a day. That's like marching from here to Huntingdon, Pennsylvania, or here to Ebensburg, Pennsylvania. So if you're watching this from somewhere else, figure that out where you are. See what's 20 to 30 miles away from where you live, and see exactly how far these guys could be asked to march in a day, especially if they were trying to get to the place where the army had already met up with the enemy. So they would be marching very quickly. So carrying a blanket roll with all your supplies, or at least with some of your supplies, was very common. Other soldiers you might see wearing knapsacks or backpacks, those kinds of things. Soldiers a lot of times found them awkward and heavy, and it was one extra thing to carry, so it was a lot more comfortable and easy to carry that blanket roll instead. Okay? Most of the things I'm wearing are strapped to me here, okay? But the one thing that is not is this. This is my canteen. Okay? Canteen, of course, is where the soldiers would carry their water. Next to the rifle, this was probably the second most important piece of equipment the soldier had. Again, marching 20 to 30 miles a day, you needed water. Okay? So on one of those long marches, When you had the opportunity, it was nice to be able to get a drink of water. The soldiers would refill these whenever they had the chance. If they were given a chance to rest and there was a creek or a stream nearby, then they would go fill up that canteen. Even if they had only taken a few sips, they'd want to get that nice and full again. This particular canteen, and again, there were lots of different styles of canteens. There's wooden canteens that look like barrels. There are canteens that are made of all metal. This particular canteen has a wool cloth covering around it, okay? And the reason for that is when I filled this up, I'd get that good and wet. I'd soak that wool down. And that does the same thing that your body does when you sweat. On a good hot day, your body sweats to help keep you cool. I know that might sound strange, but your body is sweating to keep you cool. As that moisture evaporates from your skin into the atmosphere, it actually lowers your body temperature, cools your body temperature down, and helps you regulate your body temperature. So with this canteen, what's going to happen is that water evaporates. It's going to cool down what's inside of here. If this canteen were just metal, and there were canteens like that, think about a hot slide on a hot summer day, a metal slide on a hot summer day. You slide down that slide, it's really, really hot. It burns you maybe. Okay? Well, that's what happened to the water inside of those metal canteens. If they were out in the sun as you marched or laying in the sun while you were in camp, then that gets really hot and it heats up the water inside. And you'd have a nice hot drink of water. It was still better than not having water at all, certainly, but not as good as this water. And it certainly wasn't as cool as like your Yeti thermos today, but it was a nice, refreshing drink, at least compared to some of the alternatives. So your canteen, very important. In fact, soldiers were always trying to figure out how they could carry less, but with a canteen, if you happen to have a chance to have 2 of these, you might carry 2. You might be willing to carry an extra canteen. Now everything else here is strapped to me. It's strapped to my person, and that's all done with my belt. Now this belt is not what we use a belt for today. Today we use belts to hold our pants up, right? So my pants don't even have belt loops, and my belt isn't even connected to my pants here. My belt is just going around my jacket, and the main purpose for that belt is to hold everything else down, so I don't have things flopping or getting tangled as I'm on the march, or making a lot of noise that could alert the enemy to where I was if I were trying to surprise the enemy or sneak up on the enemy. So everything is strapped against me that way. The other reason I would have a belt is to hold things, to carry things, to hold pieces of my equipment. So we'll take a look at that here as well. So first of all, on my belt, it is labeled CS. Not sure if you can see that there, but CS. And CS stands for Confederate States, just like US stands for United States. So the United States soldiers would have US belt buckles, Confederate States soldiers had CS belt buckles. Some of the reason that that's important is because it's helped us understand in more modern times where different soldiers were on the battlefield. As things like this are found and discovered, it helps people know where groups of soldiers were from. Some Confederate soldiers also wore belt buckles that had their state logo or their state seal on them. So you might find a Virginia belt buckle or a Georgia belt buckle. One of the things that the government was disagreeing about that caused the Civil War was who should have the most power. And of course that went back to slavery as well, but the southern states believed that the states should be more powerful than the national government, and they thought it should be states that were making the decisions about whether or not we should have slavery or not. The Union Army, many of those soldiers believed that many of those government leaders believed that the national government should be more powerful than the states. So a lot of the Confederates supported their state first and then their national government second. Okay? And again, these are generalizations, and you have to be careful in history with generalizations. Just like it's wrong to say that all of the Confederate soldiers supported slavery, it's also wrong to say that all the Union soldiers believed that all people should be treated equally and fairly. There were many Union soldiers that didn't believe slavery should end, or that believed that slavery was okay, but they didn't want to see the country taken apart over it. So different beliefs, different people, everybody was different. And anytime you read something in history that's a big generalization that everybody thought this way or everybody thought that way, just realize that that's a generalization statement. It's not something that's true for everyone. So that's something important to remember as well. Okay. Right. Some of the things that I have on this belt, this is my cap pouch, and I'll be showing you that in just a bit here with the rifle. This is my bayonet, which actually goes on the rifle, and I'll show you that as well here in just a moment. And then many soldiers would carry a knife, and this wouldn't have been carried as much as a weapon. If I got close enough to the enemy that this became necessary as a weapon, I was already in pretty big trouble. It could maybe be used in the case of a last resort, but I would have to be pretty close to the enemy. This is less than a foot blade, so I would have to get really close to the enemy. So I'm already in pretty big trouble if I'm fighting that closely to my enemy. Okay? More likely this would have been used as a tool for cooking, for slicing something up, maybe to whittle something with to keep my mind occupied. So just having that tool there was something important for the soldier. So let's talk a little bit about the bayonet. Okay? And we'll talk more about my rifle here in a moment. But the bayonet would attach to the end of the rifle, and basically that was a weapon that was also used as a last resort, but I would be much more likely to use this bayonet than I would to use that knife in battle if I needed to. But really, bayonets weren't used as weapons very often by the time of the Civil War. Okay? And we'll talk about that as well. When it was used as a weapon, just to show you, the soldier would stab the enemy, twist that bayonet so you can see the kind of wound or the hole that would carve in somebody, and then remove it. Okay? So again, it would be stab, twist, remove. Okay? And that was the purpose of that bayonet. It was designed as a weapon. Actually, in the years following the Civil War, this shape of bayonet, this triangle shape, was declared unethical. It was outlawed by something called the Geneva Conventions that say what is and what is not allowed in war. So this was declared illegal because this wound was very hard for a doctor or a surgeon to stitch up and heal. So the wound from that shape of bayonet was very, very difficult. More modern bayonets, the ones that were used in World War I and World War II, looked a lot more like a knife. They were just a straight blade, so that if that wound needed to be treated, the doctor could stitch that up okay, and hopefully the soldier could survive. So this type of bayonet that was used in the Civil War was later declared unethical or unusable. Now, I said that they weren't used very often as weapons because these guns were much, much more accurate than the guns that had come before, and I'll explain more about that here when we talk about the rifle and the ammunition. But what they used it for instead, well, I could stick a piece of salt pork on there and roast that over the fire. I could use it to stake my tent into the ground. Now, this kind of tent's a little different, but some of the tents had ropes and things that they would use to hold the tent into the ground. So this made a great tent stake. If I stick it into the ground like this, then this top piece makes a perfect candle holder. They even sometimes in desperation had to use them as digging tools. If they didn't have anything else available, they could dig into the soil and kind of use that to loosen the soil, to build earthworks in front of them and things to protect themselves as well. So many other uses for that bayonet. The other thing about the bayonet that I didn't mention when I showed you how it was used, it was designed to go all the way through a person as well. So the length of the bayonet was designed to go all the way through an average person, and you can see that here. So very, very gruesome and deadly weapon when it was used, but fortunately for many of the soldiers, it was not used as a weapon very often. And then it fits here. This piece is called the scabbard for my bayonet. This is my cartridge box, okay? And inside this cartridge box is where I carry the ammunition that I would be using. So this is what carries or holds my bullets. Bullets looked a lot different back at the time of the Civil War than what they do today. So that's what I'm going to show you next here. I'm actually going to put the belt back on so that I can show you that. Okay, so this is my rifled musket. It is an Enfield musket. Enfield muskets were made in England and then imported by both the North and the South during the Civil War. Okay? There were some big technological improvements in these weapons. First of all, the Civil War marked the first time that rifled weapons were used on a wide scale in an American war. Okay? Rifling means that inside this barrel, okay, it's not going to really be visible here, but inside the barrel there are spiral grooves. And what those spiral grooves are going to do is make that bullet spin when it comes out the barrel. Now think for a moment about throwing a football. When you throw a football, what do you want it to do? Well, you want a good tight spiral. Why do you want a good tight spiral? Well, because that football is going to go a lot further, and it's going to be a lot more accurate than a football that's just kind of tumbling end over end. So that's what you wanted with these bullets. When the bullets started spinning, then they would go a lot further. And this gun was accurate pretty well at about 300 yards, okay? And it was deadly even further than that. It was deadly out at about 1,000 yards. So if you happen to hit something that far away, now think about 100 yards. That's a football field from the start of one end zone to the start of the other. So when we're talking about 100 yards, we're talking about 3 football fields in distance. So pretty long distance. Compare that to the guns that were used before. And this is one of those guns. This is the type of weapon they would have used during the Revolutionary War and the French and Indian War, War of 1812. Now they had a few soldiers with rifles because rifles had been invented, but they were smaller groups of people because it took a long time. They were slow to make. They had to be made by hand. Those grooves had to be cut individually by hand by the gunsmith. So it was a long process. By the time of the Civil War, they had mechanized that ability and they were able to mass produce those rifles. Okay? This gun, though, was a smoothbore musket. So that means inside the barrel, it's smooth. That gun, or this gun, is going to be accurate maybe 50 to 75 yards at best in the hand of a good shot. And that had to do with how the tactics worked. So at the time of the Revolutionary War, at the time of the War of 1812, what you would see is soldiers lining up shoulder to shoulder, one beside the other, and then everybody would fire together. So if I have 100 of these guns, in the case of a company, 100 of these shooting at the same time, pointing in the same direction, then maybe we would hit what we were aiming at if it were further away than that. But a lone soldier standing by himself, 50 to 75 yards is about the best you could hope for. Okay? With these guns, they were still fighting the same way. The tactics didn't improve as quickly. They hadn't developed new tactics. So they were still lining up the way they had 75 years ago to fight in earlier wars, okay? Or 87 years ago in the case of the Revolutionary War. Okay? So they were still lining up that way, firing with these guns that were accurate, maybe 6 times the distance. So that was one of the reasons that caused the American Civil War to be the deadliest war in American history. Now, there were more soldiers killed in World War II, but that was worldwide. Same with World War I. More soldiers died in World War I, but again, that's worldwide. More Americans died in the Civil War than in all other wars combined. Okay, up until, I believe, the First Gulf War. So that means if you add up the number of soldiers killed in the French and Indian War that were American colonists, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, the addition of all of those together is still fewer soldiers than died in the American Civil War. They estimate between 600 and 800,000 soldiers lost their lives in the Civil War. So a huge, huge number. Okay. All right, so this is, again, my rifle. Another big difference is the type of firing mechanism. So this is my Revolutionary War era gun, and I'm going to show you the hammer and the lock plate on this gun. This was called a Flintlock Rifle. Okay, that means that right here, this is a piece of flint. This is a piece of flint stone. And when this gun is fired, it's going to hit this piece of metal and create a spark that lights gunpowder right in here. Okay? That gunpowder is connected to the inside of the barrel. That's going to light the gunpowder in the barrel and fire that weapon. This gun was very, very unreliable if it would start to rain. So if it would rain and my flint would get wet, or my gunpowder in this little section here would get wet, then this gun is not going to be firing. It's not going to be any good in the rain. Okay? By the time of the Civil War, we're using something called a percussion weapon instead. Now think about the band. If you play percussion in the band, you're playing instruments that are played by hitting them. The drums, the triangle, the xylophone, those sorts of instruments. So with this weapon, okay, when I pull the hammer back, there's this little piece called a cone. There's going to be a little brass cap that goes on there, and let me show you that. That's what's carried here in my cap pouch. Okay. So one of these little brass caps would go on there, and then when I fire this weapon, this is going to create the spark that goes into the barrel that lights my gunpowder and fires this rifle. Okay? So that was the difference that you see there. And this gun was much more reliable in the rain because I don't have to worry about that flint getting wet. I still have to keep my powder dry, but I don't have to worry so much about the flint itself getting wet. So between the rifling and between the switch from percussion or from flintlock to percussion lock, those were two big technological advancements. The third advancement had to do with the bullet itself. Okay? Now, bullets at the time of the Civil War looked a lot different. This is my cartridge, okay? Now, today guns typically use a metallic cartridge, a lot of times made of brass, but metal cartridges for our guns, okay? The bullet, the gunpowder, and what's called the primer are all in there together in one piece. At this time, they were all separate, so I have my powder and my bullet in here, and I have my primer, my part that lights the gunpowder, makes that spark, was my percussion cap here, okay? So those different pieces are separate. So what I would do if I were going to fire this gun, and I'll show you a video of this here in just a moment, but I would bite the end of this off and spit it out. Now, a neat story about that is that one of the ways when they brought the draft along after a few years in the Civil War in the Northern Army, one of the ways soldiers avoided being drafted into the infantry was by taking out their four front teeth. One of the things that you would have to have happen for you to join the Army is you would get a physical. And one of the main things they checked for when you got that physical was, do you have four teeth in the front of your mouth? If you didn't have four teeth in the front of your mouth, you could join the artillery, maybe you could join the cavalry, but you're not joining the infantry because you can't fire this weapon. When I load this weapon, I'm holding it in one hand, I'm holding my cartridge in the other hand, so I can't really be wasting time tearing this off with my fingers. It's much quicker to bite that end off, pour that gunpowder into the barrel. Then in the bottom here of this paper is where I would find my bullet. And the bullets that were being used at the time of the Civil War were known as Minie Balls. Okay? They were not called Minie Balls because they were tiny. They were called Minie Balls because they had been invented by a man named Claude Minet, who was French. But when we looked at the French name Minet and switched it over to an American pronunciation, it looked like Minie. It was M-I-N-I-E. So this is the Minie Ball. Okay? And with the Minie Ball, okay, you can see there that it's hollow in the back. Okay. Now this is a 58 caliber Minie Ball. That was the most common bore size at the time of the Civil War. So what's going to happen when I load this bullet into my barrel is, as it gets pushed down all the way to the bottom on top of that gunpowder that I poured in, that hollow space in the back, when I fire it, the gases and things that are burning from that gunpowder are going to cause the lead to expand. It's going to fit nice and tight in the barrel of the gun, so it's going to come out spinning, and that's going to give it that accuracy that we talked about earlier. So this, combined with that rifling, made this an extremely deadly weapon. Okay, just to show you a comparison here. And by the way, this is a little container I'm carrying. The soldiers would not have been carrying this. But what would have been used before that, with these earlier weapons from the Revolutionary War, the way these would have been fired is by taking that bullet, and this is a 69 caliber weapon, so 0.69 inches, a little larger than the 0.58 inch diameter of the Enfield that I just showed you. But they would load that round ball along with a piece of cloth, and that would help to fit it a little tighter into the barrel. For this to fit in this hole, it's going to have to be just a little bit smaller in diameter than the barrel itself. So that little bit smaller is going to mean that as the bullet comes out, it could be bouncing and vibrating just a little bit, and just a little bit off to the left or off to the right here, 100 yards away, 200 yards away, is going to turn into feet away from your target, or turn into hitting the ground far in front of where you were intending, or flying over the head of the enemy. So any of those things there could have been a problem. So the bullets had changed significantly as well. So the other thing I want to show you about the bullets is what would happen after they were fired. Now I have two fired Minie Balls here. These were actually fired into a tree just so I could show you what would happen. So if you take a look there, actually if I go back here and I get the unfired one again. So here it was before it was fired, here it is after being fired. Okay, and you can see how it's flattened out. Lead is a soft metal, so when it hits something solid like bone, it's going to flatten out. Okay, so the diameter increases, and what would happen if this hit your arm or hit your leg? It's going to shatter the bone. Okay, and that bone being shattered was what led to so many amputations. Really, all the doctors could do was to cut that arm or leg off. There was no way to repair a break in the bone that was that bad. Okay, so here are those two fired examples of the Minie Ball. Okay, actually, if you look at the back of this one, you can see right there the hollow spot was in the back of the bullet originally. You can actually find examples in museums, and it gives you an idea of how much lead was flying around on these battlefields, where two bullets collided end to end in midair. So just an amazing amount of gunfire being fired. Hard to imagine anybody being able to stand in that situation. Okay. There was a quote from a soldier fighting in the wheat field at Gettysburg who said there was so much lead flying it looked as if a man could hold out his hat and catch it full. So could you imagine being in a position like that, standing on a battlefield where there were so many bullets coming around you that it almost looked like you could hold your hat out and it would fill up with lead. So if you're standing there in that position. So just amazing, amazing amounts of courage. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at how this weapon would be fired. I'm going to demonstrate the procedures for loading and firing a Civil War musket using the loading in 9 times command. Following that, I will fire 3 shots. A well-trained soldier could fire 3 shots in a minute. So we'll go through those procedures right now. First command would be load. The soldier would bring the gun between his feet, reach back and unhinge his cartridge box. Next command would be handle cartridge. The soldier would remove a paper cartridge from the cartridge box, and here would be contained the bullet and the powder. As a reenactor, this would simply be the gunpowder. Next command would be tear cartridge. The soldier would bite off the end of the cartridge, bring it to the muzzle of the gun. Command charge cartridge. Powder would be poured down the barrel. The bullet would be freed from the paper and seated on top. Next command would be draw rammer. The rammer would be drawn from the holding slot and placed at a 45-degree angle. Ram cartridge. The bullet would be rammed down on top of the powder that had been previously placed in. Return rammer. Prime. The soldier would place a percussion cap on the cone of the rifle. Shoulder arms. And the soldier would then return to the position of attention. Commands would then be given to fire the weapon. Ready. Aim. Fire. Load. Arms. Shoulder, arms. Now, imagine 100 times that many guns going off in the case of a company. 50 men in the front row, 50 men behind them, all firing at the same time. Or the same thing with a regiment. Take it to 1,000 times that many, 1,000 of those guns going off at once. So on the battlefield, the smoke, the noise would be immense. It would be almost unimaginable to us. That's one of the things that I have enjoyed about reenacting, is it's given me an understanding of exactly how that would have looked, how that would have felt. And as a reenactor, when you're standing and you see 1,000 guns pointing straight at you like that. It really gives you an appreciation for the courage of the soldiers that were fighting on both sides in this war, to stand there knowing, especially if they were only 100 yards, 150 yards away, knowing that those guns are going to be fired at you, at your friends. That's something else that we didn't talk about. In a company in the Civil War, you were being formed up into these companies from your town with your friends, your neighbors, people nearby that you knew, maybe that you had grown up with, maybe your father, brother, somebody that you were very close to. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is some of the ways the soldiers would carry these weapons. So I will give the commands. Commands in the Civil War were given in two parts. There's a preparatory command, and that gets you ready. It lets you know what's coming. And then there's an execution command where you carry that out. For these commands, my execution command will mainly be arms. Okay? Now, if you want, go ahead and pause this video for a minute. Go grab a broom, grab something with a long handle, get something that you can kind of pretend is a rifle, and you can do this along with me. Maybe you have an old toy rifle, perhaps one of those little toy muskets that you can get at different historic sites. So give that a try if you have something like that, and we can kind of do this together. Okay? All right, so the first command, the position that I'm standing in right now, my gun is at my side. Okay? It's resting on the ground. This is called the butt of the rifle, so that's resting at the ground. And my arm, notice, is straight up and down. It's resting on my right side. It's sitting by my right foot, so that's important. So this position is known as order arms. I'm still standing at attention. I'm not allowed to talk. I'm not allowed to look around. I'm still supposed to be standing with my eyes facing ahead, but this is sort of a resting position at the same time. So I'm still standing at attention, but I am resting. Now, if I were allowed to talk or look around, I might be given the command, rest! And then I could kind of lean back like this. I would move my hands a little bit and relax my stance, so that was a little more comfortable. And then I would be allowed to talk. There were two different kinds of rest. In-place rest would be where I would still have to stay in my spot, but I could turn, I could talk to the person beside me as well. Attention! Okay, and then I would stand back at attention. Now, I can't march carrier with the gun dragging on the ground behind me, so I would be given the command shoulder arms. There were different tactical manuals in the Civil War. I'm going to be using the Hardy's Infantry Tactics Manual, but there were other manuals, and each of them had basically the same basic components, but they looked a little differently. So if you've seen a soldier at a reenactment doing shoulder arms and it didn't look like what I'm doing, perhaps they were using one of those other schools of teaching. So this was the way that it was done with the Hardy's Manual. Shoulder arms! Then I would lift that rifle up at the side. Now, my arm again is still straight, so I want to keep my arm straight, my elbows straight. I'm holding the gun around the trigger lock here, okay, with my thumb on top, and my index finger beneath that. So this position is known as shoulder arms. Okay? Next command. Now this gun would get very heavy. Okay, remember I mentioned earlier, we're marching between 20 and 30 miles a day in some cases. So if I'm carrying this rifle, the rifle weighed between 10 and 15 pounds, go to the bowling alley, pick up a bowling ball that's 15 pounds and walk around carrying it, or do the same with a 10-pound bag of flour at the grocery store maybe, and try to carry it down at your side for a long period of time. You're going to realize, oh, 10 pounds may not sound heavy, but if you have to carry it that way all day, it's going to get really heavy. So the soldiers couldn't do this on their own, but they could be given an order from their captain or from their sergeant to change, or from their lieutenant to change the way that they're carrying their weapon. So if we had been marching for a while at shoulder arms, maybe we could be given the command, right shoulder shift, arms. Okay? And it's exactly what it sounds like. I'm going to shift the gun from holding it down at my right side. I'm going to shift it up to my right shoulder. I'm also going to turn it around so that it's flat now. So it was this way, I'm going to turn it this way, and I'm going to lay it flat against my shoulder. I want to keep it tucked in nice and tight, holding it right above that cap pouch, because I'm going to have a soldier behind me, so I don't want to get sloppy and careless and knock them on the head. So this is right shoulder shift arms. Shoulder arms. And we would typically go back to that shoulder position in between other maneuvers. Okay? I might be given the command support arms, which is going to move the gun to my left side. It's going to look like this. Support arms. Okay, I'm going to reach over with my left hand, grab hold of the gun. I'm going to spin it around as I bring it in front of me. And I'm going to lay it on my left shoulder. Okay? Then I'm going to take my left hand, bring it to my right shoulder, and I'm going to let the hammer of this gun rest right in my elbow. So I want it high enough up that that hammer is in my elbow. I don't want it down here where it's going to slip out. So I want to have it up nice and high so that that hammer can rest in my elbow. From this position, I could also be given a command, rest, which is going to let me hold the gun this way, okay, with two hands, okay, with my other hand this way, okay? So that's support arms. Shoulder, arms. Maybe we have somebody important coming through camp or coming to review our lines. Maybe the general of the army is marching past to see how we look. So we would salute that person. Now, I would normally salute with my right hand, okay? Like this. Okay? And actually in the Civil War, the salute was with the palm outward. Okay? It wasn't like straight in the way a more modern salute would be. So a salute in the Civil War had the palm held outward and the thumb pointed down. Okay? But I can't do that when I'm carrying my rifle in my right hand. So what they did instead was they would present arms, and it would look like this. Present arms. So there we are. Shoulder, arms. And I'm kind of shouting these commands, it seems. Well, we think about the noise on that battlefield and the smoke and the confusion, so you had to really be tuned into your own commander's the sound of their orders, and they had to be nice and loud and clear. Throughout the line, there would be sergeants echoing. There were 5 sergeants in a company, so the captain would give the order. The sergeants would then echo that order so that you could make sure everybody throughout that line could hear what you were saying and understood and knew the commands. Okay? Now, the next command would be if we were marching, a lot of the time you were marching through a trail in the forest like this. So we have this wooded trail behind me. Maybe I need to walk through there. There's a lot of low branches and things. So if my gun's up at shoulder arms, or certainly if it's up at right shoulder shift or at support arms, I'm going to be getting caught on those branches. So the command here would be trail arms. Trail arms! I'm going to drop the gun down to my side, and that makes it easier for me to walk through where there's low branches and things like that. Okay, the last one I want to show you here, if it would start to rain. Now, I mentioned earlier that these guns were more reliable in the rain because you have your rifle with the percussion cap instead of the flintlock mechanism. But if the rain's falling inside my barrel, and then I pour my gunpowder in there, it's still going to get the gunpowder wet and the gun's not going to fire. So the command, if it would start to rain, would be secure arms. Okay, and it's going to look like this. Secure arms. Okay. I'm going to bring that rifle over just like I did for support arms. So when I did support arms, I brought it over, spun it around, doing the same thing, except this time instead of laying it up on my shoulder, I'm going to flip it underneath my arm. Okay. I'm going to keep my thumb on the ramrod so that that doesn't slide out, and that's where I'm going to be standing at secure arms. So now the inside of my barrel stays dry. It's the wood that's pointing up, so the metal on the top of the barrel is going to stay nice. It's not going to be rusting. So that is the secure arms command. Okay. Shoulder, arms. So I'll just run through all of those one more time here and just kind of show you here in order. Order, arms. Shoulder, arms. Right shoulder shift, arms. Shoulder, arms. Support, arms. Rest. Tension. Shoulder, arms. Trail, arms. Shoulder, arms. Secure, arms. Shoulder, arms. Present, arms. Shoulder, arms. Order, arms. In place, rest. So that was known as the Manual of Arms, and the soldiers would train, they would practice, along with practicing those firing commands and going through those motions as well. So learning how to carry this rifle, learning how to use this standing shoulder to shoulder with others was a very important part of what the soldiers would do on a day-to-day basis when they were not fighting. Okay? All right. Talked about all of those things that are attached to my belt. Let's talk about the uniform itself. Okay? Now the uniform that I am wearing, this jacket would be what would have been used especially early in the war. It's a very long jacket. It was called a frock coat. Okay? It was kind of a fancier, dressier type of uniform. So this is a frock coat, and typically later in the war you would have only seen these being worn by generals, if even those soldiers were wearing them. So I'll talk about this a little more later. This is my haversack, so we'll be getting to that here in just a bit. So there's some things about this uniform. First of all, it's made of wool, and there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, cotton is a lot more comfortable, right? What would you rather wear on a warm summer day? Would you rather be wearing a cotton t-shirt or a wool sweater? Okay, well, obviously the cotton is going to be cooler, but cotton is also a lot less durable. So usually when I'm talking to a group of students in person, what I would say at this point is go ahead and take a hold of my jacket sleeve and grab on and pull as hard as you can. And you're not going to stretch this. You're not going to rip this in most cases. So this is a much more durable fabric. This is my uniform. I'm not going home tonight and changing clothes. I don't have a big trunk in my tent that has another uniform for tomorrow and another uniform for the day after that. There were some soldiers who went the entire 4 years of the Civil War with one uniform and never had a chance to, or never bothered to wash it. They would say you could smell the army before you could see them because they didn't get to bathe regularly. So, and that led to other problems. Actually, more soldiers died in the war of disease than died of bullet wounds. So all of these things taking place. So the wool's a lot more durable than cotton, for one thing. For another thing, the South needed the cotton they were producing. They needed that cotton for money, for trade. The wool uniform was used on both the northern and southern sides, and for a lot of reasons it was for that durability and for the fact that it would last a little better. Okay. Now some other things you'll notice here on the jacket. I have this light blue coloring. Okay. Well, the light blue coloring, and this was used in both the North and the South, represented the infantry. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that I'm with the 31st Virginia Infantry, Company C. So that's sort of an identifying characteristic, that light blue trim. Not all jackets would have that, especially as the war went on, because they realized this is just using extra material that wasn't always necessary. But in this case, I have that light blue trim. Now my jacket kind of looks like it's a blue color, and that's something else that kind of shows some of the variability in the Confederacy, using whatever materials they had available. This is actually a shade that is known as Cadet Gray. It was a shade that was commonly used at some of the military academies. A Union uniform is going to be a much darker blue, a navy blue in color. But the Confederacy had many different shades. There was this uniform. My pants are a shade known as butternut. So that's this brown shade that was actually dyed using a nut, okay, to produce the dye. I have this other jacket that's a lighter gray. So in the Confederate Army especially, they used what they could get at the moment. So they had uniforms that were different shades, different colors. The Union Army pretty much are going to look the same no matter what. Their uniforms are going to be the same. The Union Army in the northern states had a lot more manufacturing capabilities. In the Civil War, the North is where the manufacturing was located. The South is where the agriculture was located. And that makes sense. The South had a longer growing season, a warmer climate, so that made a difference. And that was kind of how our country worked. The South would produce raw materials such as cotton, ship those and sell those to northern factories, and then the North would turn them into the finished products. So that was what was taking place there. Okay. Another feature on this jacket you're going to notice is the buttons. Now there were different styles of buttons, but these particular buttons, and I don't know if you can see that or if it's blurry, but this is the Virginia State Seal. So this is a time before soldiers were wearing dog tags, and some of these pieces together would be able to help identify me if something would happen and I would be found on the battlefield. So I don't know if you noticed earlier, but on my hat I have some letters and numbers, and there it says 31C. that stands for the regiment and the company that I mentioned I was representing earlier. So the 31st Virginia, Company C, that Virginia state seal on the buttons there kind of helps to illustrate that. I also had that state seal on the cartridge box here as well. So there you can see, again, the state seal from Virginia. So using that together, soldiers will be able to be identified. It's also a way that modern historians are able to learn about what unit was in what place on a battlefield. So if I found a button from a certain place, I would know, oh, this must be where the Alabama troops were fighting, or this is where the Virginia troops were fighting. Now, again, not all buttons look like that. This jacket, in fact, has buttons that have an I on them, which again stands for infantry. Okay, so different types of materials there. Now, I mentioned this was a time before dog tags were worn. I do have an early version of that. The soldiers in the Civil War started to hammer a bullet flat and then carve their name into it and wear that on their uniform. It wasn't issued by the government the way modern dog tags are, but the soldiers would start to do that themselves because one of their greatest fears was being killed on the battlefield and not being able to be identified, not having anybody be able to tell their family what had happened to them. So let's take off this frock coat for a moment, okay? Because what soldiers started to realize is that this is a lot of wasted material. You're fighting these battles in many cases in the summer months, okay? During the winter, the armies would kind of go into winter camp or winter quarters, and there weren't many battles fought in those times in the winter. So you're fighting in the summer. A lot of these battles are being fought in the southern states. So this was just a lot of extra material. It was hot. So it wasn't something that you maybe needed, and you could save some of that material and make more uniforms if you made the coats a little shorter. So this jacket is a shell jacket, and it gets that name because it just kind of covers the shell of my body. So similar idea here. Still made of wool. And it was actually considered impolite to go out with just your shirt on the way I just had there for a moment. That was actually considered your underwear because it was worn under your jacket. I would at the very least need to have a vest on with this uniform. So there we have the shell jacket. And you can see it's much, much shorter, only covers what's needed. It does the job without wasting a bunch of extra material or using a bunch of extra material in that case. Okay. The markings on my shoulder here, on my arm, are the stripes that show that I am a first sergeant. The 3 stripes mean sergeant, and then this diamond above that means the first sergeant or the highest ranking sergeant in the company. Okay. And then I had mentioned the pants before. Not too many differences there from our modern pants. I had mentioned earlier that they would not have had belt loops because they would be held up here with suspenders. Okay. And then the shirt underneath, these would be actually kind of special to the soldiers in some cases because they might have been made from someone at home, from a loved one or a family member at home. And it was just kind of that reminder that somebody at home cared about you. Somebody at home thought you were pretty special, whether it was your mother, your wife, your sweetheart, whatever the case may be there. So I'll put my fancier jacket back on here. The shoes at the time of the Civil War, okay? And it's going to be kind of hard to see this, so maybe I'll take one of the shoes off so I can show you. Okay? But the shoes at the time of the Civil War were the first time shoes were made for the right and left feet. They were the first time they were designing shoes that were curved to fit the right or left foot. Prior to that, shoes were what was called straight-lasted, which means the shoe was just a straight design and it worked the same way. Now the other thing you see here on the bottom of my shoe is actually what appears to be a small horseshoe. They called this a heel plate, and some shoes also had toe plates. Some shoes also had pieces of metal hammered in along the sole. And the purpose for that was to help keep the shoe lasting a little longer. So as you're marching on those long marches, your shoes are going to wear down. Everything on here is leather. The sole is a harder leather, and then we have our soft leather that makes up the shoe itself. So everything was leather, and as I'm marching, that leather is going to get worn out and wear down. By putting that heel plate on there, that's going to help prevent that from happening as quickly, and it's going to allow my shoes to last a little bit longer. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look in that haversack that I showed you earlier. All right, so I want to take a look at the haversack. And the haversack I always kind of compare to a purse that a lady might carry today. This is where the soldier would carry all their personal effects, all their personal belongings, anything they might want to have that they couldn't roll up in that blanket roll, or that they would just want to have along with them as they went off to war. So let's take a look inside the haversack. Now on the outside of the haversack I hang my cup, and I do that for a couple reasons. First of all, it's easy to get to. If we stop at a creek, when I fill up my canteen, I can also fill up my cup, then I don't have to start drinking out of my canteen right away. The other reason is this would take up a lot of room inside my haversack, so I'm just going to keep this here on the outside. Okay? So that's my cup. In here I would keep my eating utensils, my maybe knife and fork. Now, most of the equipment I have as a Civil War reenactor is reproduction equipment. It's things that are made today during modern times to look and feel like they would have 155 years ago at the time of the Civil War in the 1860s. So this is actually an antique. This is authentic. It was purchased from an antique store in Gettysburg. So you can notice here on the fork pretty much looks the same as today, all the silverware, but the fork itself only had 3 prongs at that time. So actually at the time of the Revolutionary War, a lot of forks only had 2 tines. Civil War we had 3, and now of course we have 4 on our modern forks. I don't know, maybe in 200 years from now we'll see forks with 5 prongs. I don't know the reason behind that changing, other than I guess to make it a little easier to hold your food. The handles on these would have been made from bone. They didn't have plastic like we do today to make things decorated, so they would have used bone or ivory in some of those cases. Okay. Now, along with my silverware, of course, I would need a plate to eat off of. So here we have an example of a plate made of tin. Okay. So this would have been made by a tinsmith. This fits nicely into that bag. Now, a lot of soldiers wouldn't have carried 2 plates, but I happen to have 2 different styles here just to show you. This one, though, is kind of neat. First of all, you can see that it's curved, so it would also serve as kind of a bowl, and you could hold things in there. But it actually wasn't designed to be a plate. It was actually originally a piece of the canteen that I showed you earlier. So this is actually half of a broken canteen. And actually, I could even tie this right to the outside of my canteen as well with a piece of string or wire, and then wouldn't have to fit it in my haversack. But that little piece would have been originally part of a canteen that had been broken, and they didn't throw things away. They found other uses for them. So in this case, I could have used this to eat off of, certainly. It would have made a great digging tool. I could actually take the spot where the canteen spout would have been, kind of tie a stick on the end there, and I could hold this over the fire and use it sort of as a frying pan, and I could actually cook right on here as well. So even an old broken piece of a canteen had a lot of uses. Okay. With some other things I had in here, I have some coffee. Now, for a Confederate soldier to get coffee, he probably would have had to trade with a Union soldier, and that happened. We think of these guys as enemies, but the regular soldiers a lot of times recognized that they were just fighting for different sides. They had a lot in common in some cases. So they would meet up after a battle off the battlefield itself, and they would trade goods, they would trade supplies, they would talk, they would exchange news, and then they'd go back to shooting at each other the next day. But you can read accounts like this in soldiers' journals and things where they met up with the enemy and they had a friendly conversation even though they were enemies at war. Maybe if I were fortunate, I had a little bit of money left from my pay that I hadn't sent home. Now, the neat thing about Confederate money is that that money was actually issued by the state. So this is a Virginia $10 bill that would have been issued by the state of Virginia. We think of our money today as United States money, United States currency, but I mentioned that the South had a strong identity with each individual state, so each state issued their own money at the time of the Civil War in the South. Okay? You might carry some matches along with you so that you could light your lanterns. They did have friction matches at the time of the Civil War. As the first sergeant, I mentioned earlier that we looked at Hardy's Manual of Infantry Tactics. So this is that manual, and inside of here are all those directions, all the things that a sergeant would have had to know to help train the troops, including the manual of arms that we looked at a bit ago. Many soldiers had a very strong religious belief, so maybe they carried a small Bible like this one. Okay, small pocket Bible would have been very important for the soldier to have. Maybe a snack. Now, this is called hardtack, and it was issued to the Army. It was basically flour, salt, and water. Okay, so with that hardtack, it was called hardtack because it was hard. And there's actually some old jokes among the soldiers. I bit into something soft in my hardtack. And his friend said, "Oh, what was it, a worm?" Because a lot of times these got nicknamed worm castles because bugs and critters would get inside them. And the soldier said, "No, it was a bullet." Okay, so the hardtack was so hard that even a bullet seemed soft compared to it. There's hardtack in museums that looks exactly like this. The salt acted as a preservative, so it would last for a very, very long time. What the soldiers would have to do is either soak it in their coffee, soak it in bacon grease, to try to soften it up before they'd eat it. Okay, but basically just a hard cracker. Maybe some candles so that I could see at night. I mentioned how the bayonet could be used as a candle holder, so these would stick right down in the bayonet. Okay. Or if I had a lantern, I could use that. I mentioned the Bible there earlier. This is a small prayer book as well. Okay. Many soldiers would keep a journal of what they were experiencing if they could read and write. They knew that they were part of something pretty important, pretty worth remembering, and they wanted to be able to remember their experiences to tell their loved ones at home, certainly, and to tell their descendants in years to come. So many of them would write down their experiences. It's one of the best ways to learn about history is by reading primary sources, reading what these soldiers had to say about their experiences. So we're very lucky that many soldiers valued writing a journal, and very lucky that many of those journals survive to this day for us to learn from. Okay. I might keep some grooming things in here to take care of myself. So perhaps a comb to help keep the lice away. Okay, lice were a big problem in the camps, so maybe combing out my hair that way would help. So that would have been made from wood. Again, plastic doesn't exist. Maybe if I cared about brushing my teeth, this is what I would have had. A toothbrush, and the bristles would have either been horsehair or hog hair, because nowadays toothbrush bristles are plastic, so they didn't have that. They used animal hair, and then bone as well for the handle. So that's what your toothbrush would have looked like. But other than that, not too much different from a modern toothbrush. Didn't have toothpaste like we do today, but they would have had tooth powder, they called it, and similar to baking soda. And baking soda is still an ingredient in our toothpaste today. So you could mix that with water to make a little bit of a paste, and then brush your teeth. If I wanted to be clean shaven, and long bushy beards are kind of in style at the time of the Civil War, if you look at some of the photographs from that time period, but not all soldiers had those long shaggy beards. So if I had wanted to be clean shaven, then I would need maybe a small shaving mirror like that. And then this was the type of razor you'd have used. It was called a straight razor. Okay, so very, very sharp, very risky. In fact, a lot of the men wouldn't shave at that time by themselves. They would go to be shaved at a barber just because it was dangerous with that type of razor. Okay. Let's see. This was called a housewife by the soldiers. It was nicknamed their housewife. And it was basically a sewing kit. If my uniform got a hole in it, if I lost a button, I needed to be able to replace all those things myself. So at that time, maybe if I were at home, I would have asked my wife to take care of that for me, but I'm not at home, so I need to take care of all those things myself. So this has extra patches of fabric, extra buttons, some thread, all those things in there that I would need to mend my clothing if I had anything that got damaged. Boredom was a big problem for the soldiers, so they looked for things to fill their time. They looked for things that would keep them busy. And some of those things included games. So here's a checkerboard or chessboard that could easily be drawn or painted on a piece of cloth, so it could fold up and go right inside with my things. And then checkers, I could just I could break off a tree branch and cut checkers out of a tree branch. Okay. And maybe I could stain one side of them black, one side of them keep wood, and I would have a checker game to play. Maybe I could even write on here some of the abbreviations for chess pieces, like P for pawn or K for king, and then I'd be able to play chess or checkers on that piece of equipment. Okay. Another game that would have been common would have been dice. Okay, so the soldiers would gamble and bet and play dice games. And so those kinds of things would be maybe found with them as well. Another game that the soldiers might have had would have been playing cards. And actually, there's reports in soldiers' journals and diaries that on their way to battle, they would actually take those playing cards and throw them away. So there's reports that soldiers knew they were either coming where there had been a big battle or were on their way toward a big battle because they'd see decks of playing cards littering the roadside. In the 19th century, in the 1800s, playing cards were associated with gambling and gamblers were associated with people of poor character. So if you died on the battlefield and your belongings were given to your family members, you didn't want them thinking you had gone off to war and become a person of poor character, so you would get rid of those playing cards before you went to battle in case you were killed in that battle. Then you could always find a new deck somewhere later on if your family, or if you survived. Now, the other thing you may notice on these playing cards is there are no numbers or letters on these. It's just the symbols. A lot of the soldiers couldn't read or write anyway, and that's true for the face cards as well, but they would be able to recognize the symbols on those cards and recognize the patterns to know the numbers. So maybe they couldn't read or write to recognize the number or letter symbols, but they knew the value of the card just based on the look of the card. Another way to pass the time would have been with music. Okay, now I have two musical instruments here that are small and easy for a soldier to carry right with him. Not something big and bulky like a banjo or a guitar, but if I carried this along with me, this is called a jaw harp, and it sounds like this. So that's a good instrument for somebody like me that doesn't know how to play an instrument, but I could keep the beat, I could keep the rhythm along with somebody else, maybe with a bit more talent than I am. And then one of the most commonly found things where Civil War soldiers had been camped are the reeds from harmonicas. So a small harmonica would make a beautiful sound that would fill the camp with music in the evening. So harmonicas were very popular among the soldiers as well. That's the only song I even kind of know, but that is Dixie. That was often considered the Confederate national anthem. It was a favorite song among the Southern soldiers, but it was actually also a favorite song of President Lincoln, and it was written by a Northerner sort of to poke fun at the South. So, but the South kind of picked that up and enjoyed it as one of their favorite songs. Okay. Then the other thing I might have with me, and probably one of the more important things I would have with me, would have been letters from home, letters from my loved ones. So I would keep these letters. I wouldn't just read a letter and throw it away, but I would keep one of these letters and I would read it over and over and over. It reminded me of my loved ones. It reminded me there was someone at home that cared about me and loved me. So I would take that letter and I would read that time and time again. If I didn't know how to read, I'd find somebody else in my camp who could read, and I would read that letter many, many, many times. Okay. So those are some of the soldiers' belongings. Those are some of the kinds of things that you may have seen a soldier carrying with them when they went off to war during the Civil War. Okay, to wrap up, I want to show you the tent itself, where the soldiers would have been sleeping. Now, first of all, on campaign, as the soldiers were off on the march, they would not have had a tent like this to sleep in. They would have slept on the ground where they stopped, rolled out their blanket, and that's where they'd sleep. Now, that didn't matter if it was raining, didn't matter what the weather was. That was their spot, that's where they were sleeping. Now, if they had been stopped in one place for a long period of time, or especially during the winter months, then they may have had a tent like this. If they were in a tent like this, there would have been between 4 and 6 soldiers in a tent this size. So when I step in, you'll kind of see how that would fit, or how tight of a fit that would have been. But that's what they did, so that they didn't have as much equipment. Now, just a very basic tent here, and again, this is called an A-frame tent. Your tent poles probably wouldn't have looked like this. These were made so that we could transport them a little more easily, but they would have just cut trees with forks in them and used that. Now if I go in here and would lay down, you can see I could lay here against the back edge, and then another guy and another guy and another guy, or we could lay long ways like this, and I could fit several more guys beside me this way as well. So in the wintertime, that would actually be a good thing because it would help to keep everybody warm, all that extra body heat. They didn't carry pillows along with them, but what I could do is just take my jacket, if I had taken my jacket off, and I could wrap around my cartridge box or maybe find a log from the fire that we hadn't used and just wrap that up, and then there's my pillow. Okay. My blankets, again, would have been made from wool, but I have one blanket underneath here. It's kind of special. The tents didn't have a floor in them the way a lot of modern tents do. So this tent was actually this blanket was actually a rubberized blanket. So it has a rubber coating on it, and that would keep the moisture from the ground from getting into me. The other nice thing about this is it has a hole in it, and so if it were raining, this would actually make a rain poncho and would help to keep me dry as well. So keep my uniform dry that way. Okay, so that would serve more than one purpose. If I had a chance, I would get more than one of these. They called them gum blankets. Okay, and I would have one for on top of me and one for underneath me. That was especially important if I was sleeping outside and it would be raining. So I would have one of these on top, one of these underneath. Okay. All right. Well, I certainly hope you have enjoyed learning about the Civil War and learning about some of the things that the common soldier would have had along with them, some of the equipment that they would have used, and some of the ways that their lives would have unfolded during this war. It's really a fascinating thing to study and learn about. I hope maybe you go to the library, get online and find some other things. I highly recommend the series of videos from the American Battlefield Trust called the In 4 series. They have Civil War in 4, they have Revolutionary War in 4. They're quick, short videos. In fact, I'm going to link one here that shows marching a little bit as well, so that you can kind of see that. But they're really, really good videos to help you get a quick overview of so many different topics relating to the Civil War. Another thing, the way I got into the Civil War was when I was in 4th grade. I had a Pennsylvania history project on the Battle of Gettysburg. I looked up and watched the Ken Burns series. It actually had just come out that year, but it's a documentary filmmaker named Ken Burns who did a series about the Civil War, and it was just called The Civil War. So if you look up Ken Burns, The Civil War, you can see that. I believe it's streaming on Amazon right now as I'm recording this, so you can stream it in different places as well, but highly, highly recommend the Ken Burns documentary, as well as the film Gettysburg. And there are some inaccuracies and things like that, like there are in any Hollywood film that's based on history, but it does a really good job of showing some of the characters and personalities. Just realize they can't tell the entire story of the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg in even a 4-hour movie like they have there. So it's hard to fit everything in, but it's great to kind of see some of this unfold, hear the dialogue, see what it looks like to have 1,000 rifles being fired at one time. So highly recommend, go out and learn more on your own, study, explore, and discover new things as well. So all of those are great ways to learn more about the Civil War, and I'd be happy to help you out with other resources as well. Just leave a comment or send me an email at john.wessner@hasdtigers.com, and I'll put that in the comments as well. So feel free to reach out to me as well if you have any questions about the Civil War or about Civil War reenacting or any of those types of things also. And I hope someday you get to see a Civil War reenactment in person. That's really the best way to do it, and to really understand what this is about. Go through the camp, talk to other reenactors, and learn from them, because they're there to teach you. They're there to help you understand what life was really like in the 1860s. So thanks so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I will see you next time.